They told the neighbors I was dangerous before they ever called me dangerous to my face. By the time I realized my own son had been telling people I was losing my mind, half the street was already watching me like I might wander barefoot into traffic. What they didn't know was this. I had proof, and I was done staying quiet. Grace here. Evening, folks. You know what scares me? Not strangers. It's family members who smile while quietly taking your life apart, piece by piece. Tell me honestly in the comments, what would you do if your own child started convincing people you were crazy? I'm 70 years old, and until last spring, I thought I understood exactly what loneliness looked like. Loneliness was eating lentil soup by yourself while rain tapped against old kitchen windows. Loneliness was folding fitted sheets alone because your husband wasn't there to wrestle the corners anymore. Loneliness was hearing the grandfather clock in the hallway tick so loudly at night that it sounded like footsteps in an empty house. But I was wrong. Real loneliness is realizing people have started talking about you instead of talking to you. My name is Opal Whitcombe, and I live on Marigold Trace in Briar Glen. It's one of those streets where everybody pretends not to stare while staring directly at you. Narrow sidewalks, polished mailbox posts, lemon-colored porch lights glowing at dusk, little ceramic robins hanging beside front doors. The kind of neighborhood where people bring cinnamon babka to funerals and still gossip in the parking lot afterward. Walter and I bought this house in 1981, back when Marigold Trace was mostly dirt lots and optimism. My husband used to say the whole neighborhood smelled like sawdust and fresh paint for the first 2 years. We planted the Japanese maple in the front yard together. It's taller than the house now. Walter's been gone 6 years, heart attack. Fast. Cruel. One minute he was complaining about the Milwaukee Brewers bullpen while buttering toast, and 20 minutes later, I was sitting in an emergency room trying to understand why the world suddenly sounded muffled. After he died, the house got quieter every year. My son Preston called less often. My granddaughter Tamsin still visited when she could, though. Sweet girl. Always smelling faintly of bergamot tea and bookstore dust because she worked at Bellwether Books downtown. She still hugged me with both arms instead of one. That matters more than young people realize. But Preston, well, there are people who slowly become strangers, so gradually you don't notice until one day they're standing in your kitchen, wearing your son's face and talking to you like your paperwork. That morning started strangely enough. I was outside trimming my rosemary bushes with Walter's old brass shears when my neighbor, Edith Corley, slowed down in the middle of her morning walk. Edith usually chatted. She loved chatting. That woman could turn weather into a 40-minute conversation. But that morning she only smiled tightly. "Morning, Opal," she said. "Morning." She hesitated. Then she asked carefully, "Everything all right today?" I remember blinking at her because it was such an odd question. "Of course," I said. "Why wouldn't it be?" "Oh, no reason." She walked away too quickly after that. I watched her go with dirt under my fingernails and a strange heaviness settling in my stomach. An hour later, things got worse. I drove down to Bell and Grain Pharmacy to pick up my blood pressure medication. Same little pharmacy I'd used for 12 years. Brass bell on the door, peppermint candies near the register. The pharmacist, Lionel, always wore suspenders that looked older than me. When I stepped up to the counter, Lionel frowned at the screen. "Your son already picked these up yesterday," he said. I laughed automatically. "No, he didn't." Lionel looked confused. It says here Preston Whitcombe authorized the refill adjustment himself. My smile disappeared. What adjustment? Lionel turned the monitor slightly toward himself again, scanning the information. Dosage reduction. Notes say there were concerns about confusion and inconsistent usage. I felt cold so quickly it almost hurt. There must be a mistake, I said quietly. Lionel looked uncomfortable now. I assumed you knew. No, I replied. I did not know. I took the prescription bag home without feeling my hands on the steering wheel. The entire drive back through Briar Glen felt different somehow, like the town had shifted half an inch while I wasn't looking. I noticed things I normally wouldn't. Curtains twitching. 2 women lowering their voices outside the bakery. A man at the crosswalk giving me that overly patient smile people use on toddlers and injured dogs. By the time I pulled into my driveway, my chest felt tight. I went inside and set the pharmacy bag on the kitchen table beside Walter's old ceramic coffee mug. Then I checked my phone. 3 missed calls from Preston. 1 voicemail. Hey, Mom, he said, voice overly gentle. Call me when you wake up from your nap, okay? We need to talk about a few things. Wake up from your nap. It was 1:14 in the afternoon. I hadn't taken a nap. I replayed the voicemail twice, then a third time. That was when I noticed it. The performance in his voice, the careful softness, like he expected someone else might hear it someday. I stood very still in my kitchen. Outside, a lawnmower droned somewhere down the street. My refrigerator hummed softly. The clock over the stove ticked once every second. Then my phone buzzed again. Not Preston this time. A neighborhood notification from the Marigold Trace residence group. I almost ignored it. Most of the posts were complaints about recycling bins or loose dogs. But then I saw my own name. If anyone notices Mrs. Whitcombe wandering again or seeming disoriented, please contact Preston directly before calling emergency services. Family is aware of the situation and handling it privately. Thank you all for your patience and compassion. Posted by Verity Kells. I stared at the screen so long my eyes started watering. Wandering again? Disoriented? Family is aware of the situation? My fingers went numb around the phone. And suddenly, every strange smile, every careful question, every awkward silence from the past 2 weeks rearranged themselves into something ugly. They weren't worried about me. They had been warned about me. By evening, I had convinced myself there had to be some explanation. That's the dangerous thing about loving someone for too long. Your brain starts protecting them before it protects you. I kept telling myself Preston probably exaggerated something accidentally. Maybe Verity misunderstood him. Maybe the pharmacy mixed up files. Maybe people on Marigold Trace were simply being nosy the way retirees often are after too much coffee and not enough purpose. But deep down, something heavier had already settled into my bones. At 5:30, Preston arrived carrying a white pastry box from Dulcet Bakery. That alone should have warned me. My son never brought pastries unless he needed something. He walked in without knocking, using the spare key Walter once insisted family should always have. Preston looked polished as usual. Camel overcoat, expensive watch, hair combed too perfectly. He smelled faintly of cedar cologne and wintergreen gum. Hey, Mom, he said warmly, like nothing strange had happened. I was standing at the sink, peeling Honeycrisp apples for a tart. You changed my medication, I said immediately. His smile flickered. Not gone, just thinner. Mom. You called my pharmacy pretending to speak for me." He sighed softly and set the pastry box on the counter. "I didn't pretend. They had permission to discuss your file." "Since when?" "We filed emergency family access after your incident." I stared at him. What incident? Now he looked at me carefully. Too carefully. "The grocery store, Mom." I waited. "You don't remember?" That sentence hit me harder than if he'd shouted. Because suddenly, I understood the game. Not direct accusations, questions, doubt. Tiny needles slipped under the skin. "I remember buying fennel and blood oranges," I replied evenly. "I remember the cashier's name was Marcy, and that she was wearing glitter on one eyelid for some reason. What exactly am I supposed to have forgotten?" Preston leaned against the counter with a patient expression that made my stomach turn. "Mom, you got confused in the parking lot." "No, I didn't." "You called me upset because you thought someone stole your Buick." I stopped peeling the apple. Because that part was true, but not the way he was telling it. "My car alarm malfunctioned," I said. "The battery remote died." He gave me a little nod, the way people humor difficult patients. "Right." That one word nearly made me throw the knife across the kitchen. Instead, I set it down carefully beside the cutting board. "You told the neighborhood I'm wandering," I said. Preston rubbed his jaw. "People were concerned." "So you announced to everyone that I'm losing my mind?" "I was trying to protect you." There it was, that word. Protect. People can hide all kinds of cruelty inside that word. I walked past him and opened the pastry box. Lemon tarts, walnut pinwheels. My favorites. Calculated. Every single thing about this conversation was calculated. "You know what's funny?" I asked quietly. "You never cared whether I took my pills correctly before." "Mom?" "No, really. Funny timing. 6 years without Walter, and suddenly everyone's worried about me right when Fenwick and Lorne starts buying property around Marigold Trace." For the first time, his expression hardened. Only for a second, but I saw it. "You're being paranoid," he said. I laughed softly. "That's convenient, isn't it?" He stepped closer. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." There was something chilling about how calmly he said it. Not angry, not emotional, like a man discussing paperwork. Then he pulled a folded brochure from his coat pocket and placed it on the counter. Silver Pines Residences. Luxury Senior Living. I looked at the smiling, gray-haired couple on the front cover, standing beside a decorative koi pond, like hostages in expensive sweaters. "No," I said immediately. "You haven't even looked at it." I said no. "Mom, this house is too much for you now. This house was built before you had chest hair." "That's exactly what I mean." I folded my arms. "Meaning?" He glanced around the kitchen, at Walter's cast-iron pans hanging above the stove, the old pie safe, the faded green wallpaper I'd never changed because Walter picked it himself. "You're stuck here," he said quietly. "No." That wasn't concern. That was irritation. And suddenly, I understood something else. This wasn't about my safety. It was about my refusal to move. I thought back to the strange visits over the past 2 months. Preston measuring windows with his eyes. Sloane commenting on property values. Verity suddenly asking whether I'd considered downsizing. Not random. Never random. Preston slid the brochure toward me again. "Silver Pines has memory care services too." Memory care. He dropped the words gently, but they landed like bricks. I felt heat crawl into my face. I do not have dementia. We're just preparing. For what? His silence answered me. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and for one horrible second, I saw a stranger wearing Preston's smile. Then his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen quickly. I caught the name before he locked it. Verity Kells. Interesting. He slipped the phone back into his pocket too fast. You know, I said slowly, people usually wait until their mother is actually dead before dividing up her life. His jaw tightened. That's unfair. No, I replied. What's unfair is finding out my own son has been telling the neighborhood I'm unstable. He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated now. You're twisting this. Am I? Yes. Then answer something honestly. I stepped closer. Did you or did you not tell Verity Kells to contact you if I seemed confused? He hesitated. That tiny pause told me everything. Finally, he exhaled. We're worried about you. We. Not him. We, meaning him and Sloan. Maybe Verity too. Maybe more. Outside, headlights swept briefly across my kitchen windows as a car rolled past the house. Preston lowered his voice. You don't understand how people are starting to see this. I stared at him. No, I said quietly. I think I finally do. That night, I barely slept. Not because I was scared. Because once you realize someone has been quietly rearranging your reality, your brain starts replaying every strange moment like evidence in a courtroom. At 2:11 in the morning, I got out of bed, wrapped Walter's old flannel robe around myself, and walked into the hallway. The house creaked softly beneath my feet. Pipes ticked in the walls. Rain whispered against the gutters outside. I stood in the dark living room, staring at the photographs over the mantel. Walter, holding Preston on his shoulders at Lake Minerva. Preston, grinning in a Little League uniform with missing front teeth. Christmas mornings. Birthday cakes. Science fair ribbons. I kept looking for the exact moment my son became someone I didn't recognize. But life doesn't work that way. People don't suddenly become cruel all at once. Sometimes greed grows quietly, like mold behind wallpaper. By morning, I had made a decision. I wasn't going to argue with Preston anymore. I was going to start paying attention. At 10 o'clock, I drove downtown to Briar Glen Courthouse Annex. The building looked exactly the same as it had 20 years ago when I worked there, processing records and transcription logs. Same limestone steps. Same terrible fluorescent lighting. Same smell of paper dust and burnt coffee. Back then, I wasn't important, just reliable. But reliable people notice things. And more importantly, they learn how evidence works. I sat in my Buick for a moment before going inside, watching courthouse employees hurry through the drizzle with folders tucked under their arms. A memory came back suddenly. Walter teasing me because I alphabetized our spice rack after spending all day organizing legal exhibits. Opal, he'd laughed once. If somebody murdered me, you'd probably label the body. I smiled, despite myself. Then I went inside. Hollis Penn still worked there part-time. Thinner now. More gray hair. Suspenders patterned with tiny trout. He nearly dropped his coffee when he saw me. Well, I'll be damned, he said. Opal Whitcombe. You make it sound like I escaped prison. With your filing skills, You basically ran this place." We sat together in the tiny records office while rain tapped against the windows. At first, I almost didn't tell him, because saying it out loud made it real. But eventually I did. The pharmacy, the neighborhood message, the brochure for memory care. The careful little questions designed to make me doubt myself. Hollis listened without interrupting, which is rarer than people think. When I finished, he leaned back slowly. "You think they're building a competency case," he said. Not a question, a statement. I felt cold again. "You really think so?" "I've seen it before." He lowered his voice. "Families don't usually start with lawyers. They start socially. Quietly. They get everyone used to the idea that you're confused." The room suddenly felt too warm. "What do I do?" Hollis looked at me for a long moment. Then he said something that changed everything. "You stop reacting emotionally and start documenting professionally." That sentence slid into place inside my head, like a key turning in a lock. He handed me a legal pad from his desk. Dates, times, conversations, messages. Keep everything. I took the pad slowly. "Also," he added, "if somebody wants to paint you as unstable, the worst thing you can do is act unstable in public." I thought about Verity. Preston. The way they spoke in soft voices like I might suddenly start eating flower arrangements. "You think people already believe them?" Hollis gave me a sympathetic look that answered before he spoke. "People believe whatever makes them feel useful." I drove home through downtown Briar Glen with the legal pad sitting on the passenger seat beside me. At a red light, my phone buzzed. A message from Verity Kells. "Hi, Opal. Just checking in. A few neighbors were concerned after yesterday. Maybe we should chat soon about some community support options." Community support options. I stared at the message until the light turned green. Then, for the first time since all this started, I stopped feeling confused and started feeling angry. 3 days later, Preston invited me to lunch. Not dinner, not coffee. Lunch. Middle of the afternoon. Public place. Carefully chosen timing. The message arrived at 8:12 that morning. "Let's reset. Just you and me. Juniper Stove Cafe, 1 o'clock. Short. Polished, like a businessman scheduling conflict resolution. I almost said no, but anger has a dangerous side effect. It makes you curious. By 12:30, I was standing in front of my bedroom mirror, fastening a pair of pearl earrings Walter bought me during our 25th anniversary trip to Charleston. Tiny things, nothing flashy. But I suddenly needed the reminder that I was still a woman, and not merely a problem people discussed in neighborhood group chats. Outside, Briar Glen smelled like wet pavement and chimney smoke. The air had that cold, metallic bite that comes right before winter settles properly. Juniper Stove Cafe sat near the old rail depot downtown. Brick walls, copper lamps, fancy little sandwiches too small for their prices. Preston used to hate the place because Walter once called it coffee for people who enjoy paying rent to cinnamon. I arrived 5 minutes early. Preston wasn't there. I ordered chamomile tea and waited beside the front window while rain streaked softly across the glass. 1 o'clock passed, then 1:15. At 1:30, I texted him. No answer. At 1:40, my tea had gone cold. By 1:50, the waitress had started giving me pity looks. I finally stood up, embarrassed enough to feel heat in my cheeks despite the cold weather outside. That was when my phone rang. "Mom?" Preston sounded breathless. "Where are you?" I frowned. At the cafe, where you told me to be. A pause. Then, Jesus Christ. Something icy slid through my stomach. What? You told me you were staying home today. No, I didn't. Mom, we've been looking for you. We. Again, that word. I'm literally sitting inside the cafe you picked. Another pause. Then his voice changed completely. Too loud. Too relieved. Stay there. I'm coming. The line disconnected. I stood frozen beside the table while the waitress awkwardly cleared my untouched tea. 10 minutes later, Preston burst through the cafe doors with Verity Kells right behind him. Not walking, performing. Mom, Preston said loudly, rushing toward me. Thank God! Every head in the cafe turned toward us. My stomach dropped. Verity touched my shoulder gently, like I might collapse. You had us worried sick, Opal. Worried sick. I stared at both of them. Rainwater glistened on Preston's coat. Verity carried that same pinched expression people use around hospice patients. And suddenly, I understood. This wasn't confusion. This was theater. I'm fine, I said sharply. Several customers continued staring. Preston lowered his voice in that humiliatingly patient tone again. Mom, you forgot to answer your phone for hours. I was driving. You said you were resting today. No, I didn't. Verity stepped in smoothly. Opal, nobody's upset. We just want to make sure you're safe. Safe. There was that poison word again. I could actually feel people in the cafe watching me now, measuring me, waiting for signs. An older man near the pastry case tilted his head sympathetically. Sympathetically. Like I was confused. My pulse started pounding. Preston gently touched my elbow. Let's get you home. I pulled my arm away immediately. I drove myself here. Yes, he said carefully. We know. The way he said it made my chest burn. Not agreement. Implication. A young couple near the window exchanged glances. God. How many times had they done this already? How many conversations had happened behind my back before I even noticed? Verity gave the waitress an apologetic smile. Sorry about all this. It's been a difficult few weeks. I looked at her so hard, she finally stopped smiling. Difficult for who? For the woman being slowly erased? Or for the people trying to erase her quietly enough that nobody objected? You know what makes my blood boil? When someone humiliates a person publicly and disguises it as concern. That's the trick. They don't scream at you. They speak softly, so everyone else thinks they're the reasonable one. Honestly, I would have remembered every face in that cafe. I forced myself to breathe slowly. Hollis's words echoed in my head. Don't react emotionally in public. That was exactly what they wanted. If I raised my voice now, every person in Juniper Stove Cafe would remember the unstable old woman causing a scene. So instead, I did something else. I looked directly at Preston and asked calmly, Who told you I was missing? For the first time, he hesitated. Tiny, but real. Verity answered too quickly. Several neighbors were worried. Which neighbors? Another hesitation. Interesting. Preston rubbed his jaw. Mom, this isn't productive. No, I said quietly. I think it is. Neither of them spoke. Rain hammered harder against the windows now. Somewhere behind the counter, dishes clattered loudly. Then I noticed something strange. Above the entrance, small black dome camera. Security footage. And immediately, my courthouse instincts clicked awake. Timestamps. Arrival times. Proof. If Preston claimed they'd been searching for me, footage would show exactly when he actually arrived. I suddenly wondered whether he'd even been worried at all before making his entrance. Maybe the performance mattered more than the search. Preston tried my elbow again. "Come on, Mom." This time I stepped back before he touched me. "I'll drive myself home." His smile tightened. "Are you sure that's wise?" There it was. Not concern, documentation. Every sentence built carefully so witnesses would remember him as patient and me as defensive. I picked up my purse slowly. Then I looked directly at Verity. "You posted about me online without asking." Her expression shifted slightly. People were concerned. "You told the neighborhood I wander." "We were trying to help." "No," I replied softly. "You were preparing people to doubt me." Silence. Real silence this time. Even Preston looked startled I'd said it aloud. For half a second, nobody moved. Then Verity gave that brittle little smile wealthy women use when they're losing control of a conversation. "Opal," she said gently, "I think you're misunderstanding everyone's intentions." Maybe. But as I walked toward the exit, something inside me finally settled into certainty. This was no misunderstanding. And whatever game they were playing, it had started long before I noticed it. That evening, I locked every door in the house. Not because I thought someone would break in, because for the first time in my life, I no longer trusted the people who already had keys. The rain had finally stopped by sunset, leaving Marigold Trace slick and shining beneath the streetlights. Water dripped steadily from the gutters outside while I sat at the kitchen table with Walter's old yellow legal pad open in front of me. Dates, times, conversations. I wrote everything down. Juniper Stove Cafe, 1:52 p.m. Preston arrives with Verity. Claims they were looking for me. Multiple witnesses present. Even writing it felt surreal, like I was documenting somebody else's life. At 8:17, my phone buzzed. Tamsin. "Grandma, are you okay?" Just reading her message loosened something tight inside my chest. "Yes, sweetheart. Why?" 3 dots appeared immediately. Then, "Dad said you got confused downtown today." I stared at the screen until my vision blurred slightly. There it was again. The story spreading. Not arguments, not facts, narratives. I typed carefully. "I was sitting in a cafe waiting for your father, that's all." A long pause followed. Then, "That's not what people are saying." People. Amazing how quickly people become weapons. Before I could answer, headlights swept briefly across my front windows. A car door shut outside. I frowned. Nobody visited me this late anymore. Another sound followed. Not knocking, metal, soft, careful. My stomach tightened instantly. I stood from the table without turning on additional lights and moved quietly toward the hallway window. A figure crossed the side yard. Slim, fast, hooded coat. At first I thought teenager. Then the porch light caught pale blonde hair escaping from the hood. Sloane. What the hell was she doing? I stayed completely still. She moved toward the back entrance like someone who'd done it before. Then I remembered. She had done it before. 2 years ago, during a snowstorm, I'd given Preston and Sloane emergency copies of my house key. My pulse started thudding hard enough to hurt. The back door unlocked softly. Sloane stepped inside. I didn't move. Didn't speak. From the hallway shadows, I watched my daughter-in-law enter my kitchen like a woman walking through a furniture showroom she already owned. She wasn't nervous. That was the worst part. She moved directly toward the counter where my medication sat beside the fruit bowl. Then she took out her phone. "I'm here," she whispered. Preston's muffled voice crackled faintly through the speaker. I couldn't hear every word, but I heard enough. "Just move them again." Sloane opened my cabinet doors calmly. Tea tins, vitamin bottles, prescription bags. She switched things around with terrifying confidence. Then she paused beside the refrigerator. "She'll notice eventually," Sloane murmured. Preston answered something low. Sloane laughed softly. "That's the point." I felt something inside me go cold and sharp. Not fear anymore. Clarity. Absolute clarity. She wasn't helping me. She was staging confusion. Suddenly, Sloane walked toward the hallway. Toward me. For one wild second, I thought she'd see me standing there in darkness. But instead, she stopped near the little entry table Walter built 30 years ago and moved my car keys. Not far, just enough. From the ceramic bowl to the mail shelf beside the lamp. Tiny change. Tiny doubt. Exactly the kind that makes a person question themselves later. Didn't I leave those there? Was that me? God. How long had they been doing this? Sloane headed back toward the kitchen. I stepped silently backward into the living room shadows, heart hammering. Then I heard her say quietly into the phone, "Another month and nobody on this street will question anything he says." He says. Not we say. He says. My own son. The floor creaked faintly beneath my foot. Sloane froze. For one horrible second, the entire house stopped breathing. Then she slowly turned toward the dark hallway. I held perfectly still. After a moment, she exhaled. "You heard that?" Preston asked faintly through the phone. "Probably pipes," Sloane whispered. She moved quickly after that. Medication bottles back in place. Cabinet shut. Keys left on the wrong shelf. Then she slipped out the back door and disappeared into the night. I stood motionless for nearly a full minute after she left. The kitchen clock ticked loudly. A dog barked somewhere down the street. My hands trembled so badly I had to grip the doorway. Not because I doubted myself anymore, because I didn't. That was the horrifying part. I walked slowly into the kitchen and stared at the misplaced keys, then at the medicine cabinet, then at Walter's old legal pad sitting open on the table. Hollis had been right. This wasn't concern. This was construction. Piece by piece, they were building a version of me the neighborhood would believe, and suddenly, I understood something even worse. If I hadn't caught Sloane tonight, I might have eventually started believing it too. The next morning, I drove 40 minutes outside Briar Glen to a clinic in Ashcombe Ridge, not because I was sick, because I needed proof. Cold, official, undeniable proof. If Preston and Sloane wanted to paint me as confused, I intended to walk into that fight, carrying documents instead of emotions. The clinic sat beside a narrow lake lined with dead cattails and silver reeds bending in the wind. Quiet place. Clean place. The kind of medical office where everything smelled faintly of eucalyptus and printer toner. I almost turned around twice before going inside. Not because I feared the results, because there's something deeply humiliating about having to prove your own mind belongs to you. The receptionist handed me forms on a clipboard. "Any memory concerns?" she asked kindly. I looked directly at her. "No," I said. "Family concerns." That answer earned a tiny pause. An hour later, I sat across from Dr. Elias Rendon, a compact man with sharp eyes and a tie patterned with little sailboats. He asked me questions for nearly 40 minutes. Dates, names, patterns, word recall, sequences, current events. At one point, he asked me to draw a clock face from memory. Walter used to joke that I could organize chaos itself into alphabetical order, so by the end of the evaluation, I practically wanted to hand the man corrected paperwork. Dr. Rendon reviewed his notes quietly. Then he removed his glasses. "Mrs. Whitcombe," he said carefully, "can I ask why someone suggested cognitive decline?" There it was again. Not observed decline. Suggested decline. I folded my hands tightly in my lap. "My son," I answered, "and several people close to him." Dr. Rendon frowned slightly. "Well," he said, tapping the file, "I see no evidence of dementia, impairment, or significant memory disorder. Frankly, your scores are excellent for any age." I didn't realize how tense my shoulders were until that moment. Relief hit so suddenly it almost made me dizzy. Not because I doubted myself anymore, because now I could prove I was right. Dr. Rendon slid a signed assessment across the desk. "If somebody is attempting legal guardianship," he said carefully, "this document matters." My heartbeat slowed. Guardianship? So Hollis had been right again. This wasn't random gossip. This had direction. Outside, cold wind whipped across the parking lot as I sat in my Buick, staring at the evaluation papers in my hands. Legally competent. No signs of cognitive impairment. Clear decision-making ability intact. 3 sentences. 3 beautiful sentences. Then my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I answered cautiously. "Mrs. Whitcombe?" a woman asked. "This is Dana from Briar Glen Community Bank. We were trying to confirm a property-backed line of credit request." I went completely still. "What request?" Pause. "The one submitted yesterday, under your name." Ice flooded my chest. "I did not submit anything." The woman hesitated immediately. "Oh. Not good. Oh. The other kind." "I'm looking at preliminary documents right now," she said slowly. "Your son Preston Whitcombe is listed as secondary financial contact." I gripped the steering wheel so tightly, my fingers hurt. "How much?" Another pause. $280,000. For a moment, I couldn't even speak. Walter's house. My house. The house we built our entire life inside. And somebody had tried borrowing against it behind my back. Dana lowered her voice carefully. "Mrs. Whitcombe, would you like us to freeze further processing until you come in personally?" "Yes," I said instantly. Then again, sharper. "Yes." By the time I reached Briar Glen Community Bank, my anger had become strangely calm. That frightened me more than rage would have. People think fury is dangerous. It isn't. Cold anger is. Dana met me privately in a glass office near the back of the building. Young woman. Nervous smile. Bright purple fingernails. She slid printed paperwork across the desk. There it was. My forged electronic signature attached to preliminary lending documents. Not perfect, but close enough to fool somebody skimming quickly. I stared at the page quietly. Dana shifted uncomfortably. We flagged it because some authorization timestamps looked unusual. Good girl, very good girl. Who submitted this? I asked. She swallowed carefully. The request originated from an IP address registered to a real estate office downtown. Real estate, of course. Sloan worked part-time for Ashford and Pike Realty Consulting. My pulse thudded once. Hard. Suddenly every piece started locking together. The neighborhood rumors, the confusion campaign, the medication changes, the staged concern, the property paperwork. They weren't just trying to embarrass me. They were trying to weaken me legally. I signed the fraud dispute forms carefully, each stroke of the pen steady and deliberate. Then Donna handed me another paper. A temporary security freeze request. Additional account protections. Emergency contact removal. I signed all of it, every single page, and when I finished, I finally said the thing that had been growing quietly inside me for days. My son is not authorized to make decisions for me anymore. 2 nights later, Verity Kells sent out another neighborhood notice. Emergency community discussion regarding safety concerns on Marigold Trace. Attendance encouraged. Safety concerns. That woman wrapped poison in polite language like it was embroidery. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at the Lantern Grange, the old community hall near Briar Glen Park. Walter used to call it the place where retirees go to weaponize muffins. By 6:30, the parking lot was already half full. I sat inside my Buick for a moment, watching people walk toward the entrance carrying casserole dishes and folded umbrellas, like this was some harmless social gathering instead of a quiet execution of someone's reputation. Part of me wanted to drive away. But another part, colder now, sharper, knew that disappearing would only help them. So I went in. The Lantern Grange smelled like burnt coffee, lemon polish, and old carpeting. Folding chairs had been arranged in neat rows facing a projector screen no one was using yet. Neighbors whispered in little clusters beneath warm yellow lights. And the second I walked inside, conversations shifted, not stopped. Shifted? That was worse. You can feel when people have already discussed you before you arrive. Edith Corley gave me an overly bright smile. Someone near the back avoided eye contact completely. A younger couple I barely knew suddenly became fascinated by the cookie table. Then I saw Preston, standing near Verity. Of course. He wore another one of those calm expressions that now made my skin crawl. Concerned son. Patient protector. The role fit him too well. Sloan stood beside him in a cream-colored coat, holding a paper cup with both hands like she was attending a prayer vigil. Performers. Both of them. "Mom," Preston said warmly as I approached. "I'm glad you came." Interesting phrasing. Not relieved, not surprised. Glad. As if my attendance completed something. "I almost didn't," I replied. Verity stepped forward immediately. "Opal, this is just a conversation. Nobody's attacking you." People who say that usually plan to. I took a seat in the third row, not front, not back. Close enough to see faces clearly. The meeting started 5 minutes later. Verity stood at the front with a clipboard pressed against her cardigan. Behind her, rain tapped softly against the high windows of the hall. "We've had several recent incidents on Marigold Trace," she began carefully. "And as neighbors, we have a responsibility to support one another compassionately." Compassionately. There was that word again. Always soft words before hard intentions. She continued talking about community awareness and senior vulnerability, never saying my name at first, but circling it constantly, like a hawk. Then Preston stood. That part surprised me. Apparently, this had become coordinated enough for speeches. He looked around the room with practiced sadness. "As many of you know," he began, "my mother has been struggling lately." There it was. Spoken publicly now. Officially. I heard someone exhale quietly behind me. Preston kept going. "She gets confused sometimes, misplaces things, wanders when she's upset. We've been trying to manage it privately with dignity." Manage it. Like I was flooding damage. My hands tightened slowly around my purse strap. Sloane lowered her eyes at exactly the right moments. Verity nodded sympathetically beside him. It would have been impressive if it weren't disgusting. Then Preston said something that made my stomach turn completely cold. "We're worried she may become unsafe living alone." Unsafe. Not unhappy, not lonely. Unsafe. That word changes everything legally. Suddenly, Hollis's warning echoed loudly in my head. Competency case, guardianship, preparation. A woman across the aisle looked at me with open pity now. Pity. God, I hated that look. Verity folded her hands carefully. "We simply want to discuss possible support measures." Support measures. Another polished phrase hiding handcuffs underneath. Then she finally said it. "We thought it might help if Preston became Opal's primary neighborhood contact moving forward." My heartbeat slowed instead of speeding up. Interesting. Very interesting. Not emergency contact. Not family contact. Primary neighborhood contact, meaning complaints, incidents, concerns, all routed through him first. Control. That's what this was about. A man near the front raised his hand awkwardly. "Has a doctor actually evaluated her?" For the first time all evening, I saw tension flicker across Preston's face. Tiny, but real. Sloane answered too quickly. "We're in the process of arranging evaluations." Lie. Clean lie. Because I already had one. In my purse. Signed. Dated. Official. And suddenly, sitting there beneath the yellow lights of the Lantern Grange, while neighbors watched me like a fragile object about to crack, I realized something important. They thought I still didn't know the game they were playing, which meant they were getting careless. The morning after the meeting at the Lantern Grange, I stopped feeling hurt. That may sound cold, but there's a point where humiliation burns itself out and leaves something harder behind. Clarity. I woke before sunrise, made chicory coffee in Walter's dented percolator, and spread everything across my kitchen table. The pharmacy records, the bank freeze forms, Dr. Randone's evaluation, my handwritten notes. Dates. Times. Statements. For the first time since this nightmare started, the chaos looked organized. And organized things can be fought. At 9:30, I drove downtown to the county records office. Briar Glen looked deceptively peaceful that morning. Red brick storefronts, damp sidewalks, the smell of fresh rye bread drifting from Holloway Bakery. People walking dogs and carrying paper coffee cups like ordinary life was still happening. Maybe for them it was. For me, every street suddenly felt layered with hidden conversations. The county records office sat inside an old sandstone building beside the courthouse annex. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead while ancient ceiling fans pushed warm, dusty air around the room. A young clerk with silver fingernails looked up as I approached. "How can I help you?" I need property transaction records for Marigold Trace, I said. Specific address? Yes. I gave her mine. Then the addresses beside it. And the one across from it. Her eyebrows lifted slightly as she typed. Interesting. Very interesting. Looks like there's been a lot of recent acquisition activity in that area, she said casually. I kept my expression neutral. From who? She turned the monitor slightly. Fenwick and Lorne Estates. There it was again. The same development company Preston had pretended not to know anything about 2 months earlier during Sunday lunch. Back then, Sloan had called the company visionary. Now I understood why. The clerk printed several transaction summaries for me while I quietly read through zoning notes and development filings. Luxury retail corridor. Mixed-use redevelopment. Projected property value escalation. Then I saw something that made my stomach tighten. A preliminary intent document, unsigned on my side, but partially completed, my address included. Marigold Trace wasn't just being discussed, it was already being assembled, and somebody had apparently expected my house to be part of the deal. I drove straight from the records office to Bellwether Books downtown, where Tamsin worked mornings. The little bookstore smelled like cedar shelves and espresso beans from the cafe corner. Wind chimes jingled softly as I stepped inside. Tamsin looked relieved the moment she saw me. Grandma. That one word sounded real, not cautious, not performative. Real. She came around the counter quickly and hugged me hard enough that my eyes burned for a second. You okay? She asked quietly. I will be. She studied my face carefully. Dad's acting weird. I almost laughed at the understatement. We sat together in the tiny reading alcove near the back of the store, while rain clouds gathered again outside. I didn't tell her everything, not yet, but I showed her enough. The forged loan paperwork, the medication records, the cognitive evaluation. Tamsin's face slowly lost color as she read. Oh my God, she whispered. Your father thinks if enough people doubt me, eventually I'll lose leverage. Leverage, she repeated. My house. Silence settled between us. Then Tamsin looked up sharply. Wait. She reached for her phone. I saw something. Her fingers moved quickly across the screen. My mom left her tablet open last week, she said slowly. I wasn't snooping, but I saw a message pop up from your dad. My pulse slowed. What message? Tamsin swallowed, then turned the phone toward me. A photograph. Blurry, but readable. A text thread. One sentence visible near the bottom. Once the neighbors fully believe she's unstable, the rest gets easier. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly over Briar Glen. Tamsin looked sick. I thought maybe I misunderstood, she whispered. Grandma, are they seriously trying to take the house? I stared at the screen, at my son's words, at the casual cruelty packed inside one sentence. Not grief, not desperation, strategy. I handed the phone back carefully. Yes, I said quietly. I think they are. Tamsin looked toward the front of the bookstore as if afraid someone might overhear us. Then she lowered her voice. There's more. My chest tightened. What more? She hesitated. Mom mentioned some investor dinner last month. She said once you were settled somewhere appropriate, everything on Marigold Trace would move faster. Settled somewhere appropriate, like I was furniture. The anger inside me didn't explode anymore. It sharpened. That was worse. Tamsin touched my hand gently. "What are you going to do?" I looked out the bookstore window at the gray afternoon gathering over Briar Glen. Then I thought about Preston standing inside the Lantern Grange pretending concern while quietly building a cage around my life. And for the first time since all this began, I stopped thinking about defense and started thinking about exposure. By Sunday evening, I had enough evidence to frighten any decent person. The problem was, decent people weren't the ones I was dealing with anymore. I spread everything across my dining room table beneath the amber glow of Walter's old stained glass lamp. Papers covered nearly every inch of wood. Bank records, screenshots, medication logs, property filings, my cognitive assessment. And right in the center sat the photograph Tamsin had shown me. Once the neighbors fully believe she's unstable, the rest gets easier. I kept staring at that sentence. Not because it shocked me anymore, because it revealed something important. Preston thought this was already over, and people get careless when they think they've won. At 7:40 p.m., someone knocked at my door. Not Preston, not Sloan. Rhea Calder, tall woman, silver bob haircut, dark wool coat still damp from rain. She'd handled property disputes in Briar Glen for 20 years and had the kind of face that made dishonest people suddenly remember appointments elsewhere. I'd contacted her that morning. Now she stood in my hallway studying the documents spread across my dining room table. For nearly 30 minutes, she said almost nothing. That frightened me more than if she'd gasped. Finally, she removed her glasses slowly. "Well," she said, "this is coordinated. Not emotional, not messy. Coordinated." I folded my arms tightly. "Can they actually take the house?" "Not yet." Yet. I hated that word immediately. Rhea tapped the forged loan paperwork. The dangerous part isn't the documents themselves, it's the narrative surrounding them. I nodded slowly. She's confused. She wanders. She forgets things. Rhea looked directly at me. Exactly. If enough people accept those claims socially, legal intervention becomes easier later. There it was again. The real plan. Not immediate theft. Preparation. Conditioning. I walked toward the kitchen and poured us both coffee. My hands stayed remarkably steady now. Somewhere over the last week, fear had transformed into focus. "What do I do?" I asked. Rhea accepted the mug carefully. "You stop defending yourself privately." I looked at her. "You expose them publicly?" The words settled heavily into the room. Outside, wind rattled branches against the windows. Rhea sat back at the table. "Right now, they control the story because they introduced it first. That's how these situations work." She pointed toward the screenshot from Tamsin's phone. "But this changes things." I stared down at Preston's message again. The rest gets easier. Cold sentence, businesslike, almost bored. My son had discussed destroying my credibility, the same way Walter once planned deck repairs. Rhea continued speaking calmly. "Do you know why manipulative people hate documentation?" "Why?" "Because documentation doesn't panic." That line stayed with me. Documentation doesn't panic. For the next 2 hours, we organized everything chronologically, every interaction, every lie, every attempt to establish me as incompetent. By 10:30, the dining room table looked less like chaos and more like prosecution material. Then Rhea asked the question I'd been avoiding. "Do you want reconciliation," she said carefully, "or consequences?" I opened my mouth immediately, then stopped, because the truthful answer hurt. A small part of me still wanted Preston to walk through that door and become my son again. But another part finally understood something terrible. The version of Preston I kept mourning might already be gone. "I want this to stop," I said quietly. Rhea nodded once. "Then you need witnesses." As if summoned by the sentence itself, my phone buzzed. Neighborhood notification. Another meeting at the Lantern Grange. Tuesday night. Community discussion regarding ongoing concerns surrounding resident well-being and neighborhood safety. Resident well-being, neighborhood safety. Same poison, different wrapping. Rhea read the notice over my shoulder. Then she smiled slightly for the first time all evening. "Oh," she said softly. "Perfect." I frowned. "Perfect?" "They're giving you a stage." A strange silence followed. Rain tapped softly against the windows again, while somewhere down the block, a dog barked twice. I looked around my dining room, at the evidence, at Walter's old lamp. At the house Preston thought he was slowly taking from me. Then I looked back at the meeting notice glowing on my phone screen. For days, they had controlled every room I walked into. The pharmacy, the cafe, the neighborhood hall. Everywhere I went, people had already heard their version first. But now I had proof. Real proof. And suddenly, I realized something else. Preston still believed I would arrive at that meeting emotional, frightened, defensive. He expected tears, confusion, maybe anger. What he did not expect was preparation. Before leaving, Rhea stopped beside my front door and turned toward me. "One more thing," she said. "What?" "When manipulative people lose control of the story, they usually panic." I thought about Preston's careful voice. Sloane moving my keys in the dark. Verity speaking about me like a liability report. Then I asked the question already forming in my mind. What happens if they panic publicly? Rhea opened the door slowly. "Then," she said, "the shame changes sides." Tuesday night arrived cold enough to frost the edges of car windows. By the time I pulled into the Lantern Grange parking lot, the building glowed like a lantern against the dark Briar Glen streets. Cars lined both sides of the road now. More people than last time. Word had spread. People always come when they think they might witness a collapse. I sat inside my Buick for a moment with both hands resting on the steering wheel. Not trembling. Steady. That surprised me. On the passenger seat beside me sat a leather folder containing every piece of evidence Rhea and I had organized. Behind it rested my old portable projector, the same one Walter bought years ago to show grainy vacation slides nobody actually wanted to sit through. Funny how objects survive long enough to become useful twice. When I entered the hall, conversation softened instantly. Not out of kindness. Expectation. Preston stood near the front beside Verity and Sloane, exactly like before. Same arrangement, same concerned expressions, same performance. Only this time, I noticed something new. Confidence. Dangerous confidence. They thought tonight would finish this. Verity approached first, clipboard in hand. "Opal," she said gently, "I'm glad you came." I smiled politely. I wouldn't miss it. Something about my tone made her blink. Good. People should get uncomfortable before storms. The room filled quickly. Folding chairs scraped against the wooden floor, while neighbors whispered behind paper coffee cups. Someone had brought pumpkin bars nobody touched. Rhea arrived 5 minutes before the meeting started and quietly sat beside me in the second row. Preston noticed her immediately. I watched the exact moment recognition hit his face, then concern, then calculation. Interesting. Very interesting. At 7 sharp, Verity stepped to the front of the room. "Thank you all for coming," she began warmly. "Tonight is about ensuring safety, compassion, and proper support within our neighborhood community." There were those soft words again. Safety, compassion, support. The vocabulary of people preparing to take something from you politely. Verity continued speaking, while Preston stood nearby, wearing the expression of a grieving saint. Then came the part I'd been waiting for. "After several incidents and growing concerns," Verity said carefully, "Preston has volunteered to coordinate well-being oversight for Opal moving forward." Oversight. Not help. Oversight. I almost admired the wording. A few neighbors nodded sympathetically. One woman sighed quietly. And then Preston stepped forward. "My mother deserves dignity," he said solemnly. "This hasn't been easy for our family." Family. Interesting how people invoke family most loudly while dismantling it. This is the moment where most people break emotionally. Public room, everyone staring, your own child speaking like you're already halfway gone. But honestly, if I were Opal, I'd do exactly what she's about to do. Calm voice, hard evidence, no screaming. That's what terrifies liars most. Preston kept talking. She forgets appointments, misplaces medication, becomes disoriented under stress. Every sentence carefully crafted, not dramatic enough to sound cruel, just believable enough to spread. Then he made his mistake. She's no longer capable of managing major decisions independently. There it was, the real objective. Not concern, authority. Rhea leaned slightly toward me and whispered, "Now." I stood slowly. The room quieted almost immediately. Preston looked prepared for tears. Instead, I lifted the leather folder calmly. "You've all heard a great deal about my mental condition," I said evenly. "So I brought documentation." Silence. Real silence. Not even chair movement now. I walked to the front of the room before anyone could stop me. Verity attempted a strained smile. "Opal, maybe this isn't—" "No," I interrupted softly. "I think this is exactly the place." That startled her. People like Verity rely on others staying socially obedient. I placed the folder on the table beside the projector. Then I looked directly at my son. "You told the neighbors I was confused," I said. "But you forgot something important." Preston's jaw tightened slightly. I opened the folder. Confused people usually don't keep records this organized. A few nervous laughs flickered across the room. Good. Pressure cracks crowds first. I lifted the first document. Independent cognitive evaluation from Dr. Elias Rendon, I announced clearly. No dementia, no impairment, no cognitive instability. Several heads turned immediately toward Preston. His expression changed for the first time all evening. Tiny crack, but visible. Sloane folded her arms tightly. I continued. "Next," I said calmly, "we have forged financial documents submitted against my property without my authorization." Now people started murmuring openly. Verity's face drained slightly. Preston stepped forward quickly. Mom, this isn't the place. Oh, I think it is. My voice stayed perfectly level. That frightened him more than shouting would have. I connected the projector. The machine hummed softly to life. Then the wall behind Verity lit up. And suddenly, the room was staring at screenshots instead of me. Bank records, messages, dates, timelines. The text from Tamsin's photograph appeared large across the wall. Once the neighbors fully believe she's unstable, the rest gets easier. A sharp inhale rippled through the room. Preston went pale. Actually, pale. Sloane stood abruptly. That's out of context. I turned toward her slowly. Wonderful, I said. Then please explain the context. She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. And for the first time since this nightmare began, nobody in that room was looking at me like I was crazy anymore. Nobody spoke for nearly 5 full seconds after the screenshot appeared on the wall. 5 seconds is longer than people think. Long enough for faces to change. Long enough for certainty to crack. Long enough for shame to start moving across a room like smoke. Then everything broke at once. That message was private, Preston snapped suddenly. Interesting. Not fake, not manipulated. Private. Wrong defense. A murmur rolled through the Lantern Grange. Someone near the back whispered, Jesus Christ! Sloane stepped toward the projector table, voice sharp now. You had no right to show personal conversations publicly. I looked directly at her. And you had every right to convince people I was mentally unstable? That landed harder than shouting would have, because now the room had context. Not rumors. Context. Verity attempted to regain control immediately. Let's all calm down. Calm down? Edith Corley interrupted from the third row. You told us she was wandering around confused. Several people turned toward Verity at once. Good, very good. Pressure was finally changing direction. Preston rubbed both hands over his face quickly, abandoning the patient son performance for the first time all evening. Mom, he said tightly, this has gotten blown completely out of proportion. No, I replied calmly. It finally became proportionate. Rhea stood beside me then, composed as ever. There is also the matter of unauthorized financial filings connected to Mrs. Whitcombe's property, she said. Now the room really shifted. Because gossip is one thing. Possible fraud is another. Sloane's face lost color immediately. Preston spoke too fast. That wasn't finalized. Interesting again, not denied. Just minimized. I lifted another document from the folder. Someone attempted to open a $280,000 credit line using my property. A man near the front muttered, Holy hell. Verity looked visibly panicked now. Good. People like Verity only enjoy public meetings when they control the narrative. And tonight? The narrative had slipped its leash. See, this is what happens when lies meet receipts. Suddenly, all those soft little concerns don't sound compassionate anymore. They sound calculated. And honestly, the moment Preston said the messages were private instead of fake, that was the moment he lost the room. Preston turned toward the audience quickly. You don't understand, he said. We were trying to help her. Nobody answered. That silence was devastating, because earlier they would have nodded. Now they were thinking. Finally, thinking. Tamsin stood near the back wall beside the entrance, pale but steady. I hadn't even seen her come in. Preston noticed her too. His expression tightened instantly. "Tamsin," he said sharply, "did you show her my phone?" Tamsin didn't move. "You lied about Grandma," she answered quietly. The room became even stiller somehow. I watched my son realize, piece by piece, that the performance was collapsing. Not dramatically, publicly, which is worse. Sloane folded her arms defensively. Everybody's acting like we committed some crime. We were worried about her. I turned toward her slowly. "Then why were you inside my house moving my medication?" That hit like broken glass. Verity blinked hard. "What?" Sloane's face changed instantly. Tiny flicker. Panic. "There's security footage," I added calmly. "Not a bluff. Real footage." And suddenly, several neighbors looked physically uncomfortable, remembering all the times they'd smiled sympathetically at Preston while discussing me like damaged property. Edith Corley actually covered her mouth with one hand. "Oh my God," she whispered. Preston tried one final pivot. "You're twisting things," he said. "Mom, you've been isolated since Dad died. You're paranoid. Everybody here knows you've changed." I looked at him quietly for a long moment. Then I answered softly enough that people had to listen carefully. "Of course I changed. My husband died." That silenced him completely. Because grief sounds very different from instability when someone finally says it out loud. I stepped away from the projector table slowly. "Do you know what hurt most?" I asked the room. Not the paperwork, not the lies. Nobody moved. It was watching people believe them without ever asking me directly. Several neighbors lowered their eyes. Good. They should. Verity finally tried to speak again. "Perhaps we should postpone this discussion." "No," said a man near the back. "I think we should finish it." Interesting. Very interesting. The room no longer belonged to her. Rhea closed the folder neatly. "For legal reasons," she said calmly, "copies of these materials have already been preserved and submitted appropriately." Preston went completely still. He finally understood this had moved beyond neighborhood gossip, beyond social pressure, into consequences. Real ones. For the first time all evening, he looked at me not like a confused old woman, but like an opponent. And strangely enough, that hurt less. The meeting at the Lantern Grange ended without anything officially concluding. No vote, no applause, no dramatic police entrance like in television shows. Real humiliation is quieter than that. People simply stopped standing near Preston. That was the first thing I noticed. Clusters shifted naturally across the room, like birds changing direction midair. Neighbors who'd spent weeks nodding sympathetically at him now avoided eye contact altogether. Verity disappeared into the kitchen area near the coffee urns and stayed there longer than necessary. Sloane sat rigid in her chair, staring at the floor while whispers traveled around her like cold wind. And my son. Preston looked exhausted. Not guilty yet, just exposed. There's a difference. Tamsin drove behind me all the way home that night because she didn't want me alone. Rain followed us through Briar Glen in silver streaks beneath the streetlights. The roads were nearly empty except for delivery trucks and the occasional glowing diner window. When we reached Marigold Trace, my house looked exactly the same as it always had. White porch railings, Japanese maple swaying softly in the dark. Kitchen light glowing warm behind lace curtains. Funny thing about betrayal. The world doesn't change shape around it. Your house still waits for you exactly where you left it. Tamsin hugged me tightly at the front door. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For what?" "For not seeing it sooner." I touched her cheek gently. "You saw it when it mattered." She cried a little then, quietly, like someone mourning two people at once. The grandmother she almost lost, and the father she suddenly didn't fully recognize anymore. The next week moved strangely fast. Almost too fast. Rhea filed formal protections on the house and financial accounts. Preston's authorization access disappeared completely. The attempted property-backed credit request triggered an internal fraud review at the bank. Verity resigned from the Marigold Trace Committee 3 days later, citing personal stress. Personal stress. Interesting phrase. Meanwhile, Fenwick and Lorne suddenly stopped contacting homeowners on our street altogether. Apparently, developers dislike attention. Who knew? Preston came to my house one final time the following Thursday evening. No pastries this time. No performance either. He stood on my porch, looking older somehow. Rain-dark circles beneath his eyes. Wrinkled coat. Hands shoved awkwardly into his pockets like a teenager preparing for punishment. "I just want to talk," he said. I almost didn't open the screen door. But I did. We sat in the living room beneath Walter's old stained glass lamp while the grandfather clock ticked softly nearby. For nearly a full minute, neither of us spoke. Then Preston finally exhaled hard. It got out of control. No, that wasn't truth. That was damage management. "You started it," I replied calmly. He rubbed both hands over his face. Sloane kept pushing about the property deal, and then Verity got involved, and I raised my hand immediately. "No." He stopped talking. "You do not get to hand pieces of your conscience to other people now." That landed. I saw it. Preston stared down at the rug. "Walter and I bought 22 years ago from a roadside antique market. I was trying to secure our future," he said quietly. "At the cost of mine." Silence again. Then he whispered the sentence I think he believed would fix everything. "I never thought people would turn against you like that." And there it was. The truth. Not regret for hurting me. Regret that the crowd became uglier than expected. I looked at my son for a long moment. Then I realized something strange. I wasn't angry anymore. Just tired. "You told people I was crazy," I said softly. "Do you understand what that does to someone my age?" His eyes watered slightly. Good. Let him feel at least one sharp edge of it. "When older people speak," I continued, "the world already listens less carefully. You knew that." He didn't answer, because he knew I was right. Finally, I stood. Conversation over. Preston looked panicked suddenly. "Mom!" "I'm not throwing you out of my life," I said quietly. "But you don't get to walk back into it like none of this happened either." That hurt him. Again. Good. Some wounds should stay tender long enough to teach something. After he left, I locked the door gently behind him and stood in the hallway, listening to the silence settle back into the house. But this time, it wasn't lonely silence. It was peaceful silence. A month later, I transferred the house into a protected trust under Rhea's guidance. After my death, a portion would go to Tamsin. Another portion would fund legal assistance for elderly residents facing financial manipulation or coercion from relatives. Rhea called it a remarkably strategic structure. Walter would have called it revenge with paperwork. Personally, I preferred Walter's version. Last Sunday evening, I sat alone on my porch with a cup of cardamom tea wrapped between both hands, while autumn wind carried the smell of fireplaces across Marigold Trace. Neighbors waved again now, some awkwardly, some sincerely. The shame had moved exactly where it belonged. And as the porch light glowed softly beside me, I looked out at the street where people once watched me with suspicion and thought something I never expected to think again at 70 years old. I was no longer defending my life. I was finally living it again. And honestly, Opal handled this better than most people ever could. Me? I would have never forgiven the public humiliation, but she did something smarter than revenge. She made sure nobody could quietly erase her again. If you made it this far, leave a like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, what would you have done in Opal's place?